I have some pre-recorded and some not recorded lectures. Can the not record or like live lectures at least be the ones in the afternoon? So we don't have to wake up at 8 every first day.
Yeah. So this is an unusual day, right? I mean, the reason that we're having class today is because we didn't have class last week because I was teaching another course. So this was the only time that apparently fit for you guys' schedule and my schedule to be together. But this is not a normal class, right? If you look at the rest of the schedule, they're already all pre-scheduled and they're all on Wednesdays, I believe. Well, that's not quite true. There's a couple that are like different when this or that happens, but I don't do the scheduling, so it
Okay,
is what
that's
it
fair.
is. Um, but if you look at the rest of your schedule for the rest of the semester, you're going to see that they're almost all on Wednesdays.
Okay, great. It's just very early.
So in past years, I've actually had a class, of course it happens, right? I mean, some of the classes are at 8. I mean, when you have classrooms and you have to schedule, there's physical space that is a constraint. Obviously, that's not true now. It's more just people's schedules. But then, I've often had classes that are at 8. So imagine then you'd have to get up, get to class, and be there by 8. So could be worse. But yeah, this is going to be unusual this semester. Typically, I think they're all in the afternoon. I think there's I'm remembering when I was looking at the schedule, but I think there's like a couple of weeks where we have vacation, so then they have to reschedule them, and then they can be at different times. But almost always they're going to be the time of yesterday's class.
Good morning,
Morning.
David. Your CV says you speak Turkish. How come so?
Because my wife is Turkish. O Türkiye'de yaşadım bir süre. Birkaç yıl. In case everybody speaks Turkish. That's why I speak Turkish. I lived in Istanbul for a year. My Turkish isn't that good. My after all these years now, it's been like 10 years, more than 10 years. My speaking isn't that great actually because I don't speak that much, but I hear my wife speaking on the phone all the time, and she like says things to me in Turkish so that my son doesn't understand it as well, so stuff like that. But I'm pretty decent at Turkish, at least at understanding it. I also lived some time in China, so I can actually speak a little Chinese too. 我在中国住了一段时间，在台湾，不知道你们不知道算不算 China，这不知道算不算中国，在台湾。看你的政治观点。Yeah, my Chinese used to be really good. I actually regret. So my Turkish was never that great, but my Chinese at some point was actually pretty good. So I regret the fact that I don't have any chance to practice anymore, and it's definitely not as good as it used to be. The language that I'm probably, of the foreign languages, the one that I'm the worst at is, besides, so for me, foreign languages other than English, the one I'm worst at that I know a bit of is probably Danish. I can hardly speak it. I can read it pretty well though at this point. My understanding is okay. It's just the problem is that, it's like I noticed, like, so yesterday I pick up a package, right? So yesterday I go to some shop and pick up a package, and I start in Danish, but then as soon as they realize that I'm not Danish, then they just switch to English. And then, I mean, I could continue speaking in Danish, I guess, but it's a little bit weird. All right, well, it's 8 o'clock, and thank you everyone for being here. As Kai was saying a minute ago, it's pretty early. This is as early as it gets at CPS. Although, like I was saying, it used to be that sometimes they'd schedule my classes at 8, and then you'd have to be there at 8 physically in the classroom. So I guess that would be even earlier, but this is pretty early. And if you weren't here, this is unusual, right? This isn't our normal schedule. This was a rescheduled class that was made to fit with your schedules and my schedules. So typically the classes are going to be on Wednesday afternoons. But anyway, what I want to talk about this morning is things are going better than you think. So this is kind of a fun lecture. I think that people get very negative about like the news and what's happening. We have more authoritarianism. We have, all this climate crisis going on. More populism. Will the world be able to get through all these crises we have? So I think sometimes it's nice to just take a step back and think about how things are going from like a more historical perspective. And then also, so the way I'm going to structure this talk is that I kind of present, it's all based on a book by Steven Pinker. And I'm going to sort of present a few things, and then I'll like bring up a question that says, okay, well, you didn't talk about this other thing, or there's this other thing that's going badly that you missed. So you'll see how it goes as it goes. It's more or less a lecture. So it's based on the book Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. A really fun book. It's a long book, but it basically is going to make the point that I make here, but in much more detail. It's not really, the book itself isn't part of the course material. I'd like you to remember that you don't have to remember like the details from each slide. This isn't one of the models that I'm really going to test you on in the course, but it's a really good read, and I think it's a really good way to think about economic growth and why that could be important. Okay, so there's an economist named Bob Lucas. He's won the Nobel Prize in 1988, and he's actually one of the economists that's very closely associated with growth theory, especially endogenous growth theory. He won the Nobel Prize. He didn't win it in 1988, but he said this in 1988, which he said, "The consequences for human welfare involved in questions of economic growth are simply staggering. Once one starts to think about them, it's hard to think about anything else." So the free lunch, right? In economics, there's no free lunch. I actually alluded to it for just a minute yesterday, but what is economic growth from that macroeconomic perspective, really? Okay. So the way I like to do it is to think about the economy as like a giant factory. So in the factory, there's some inputs. Those are like the labor and capital that the economy has. So the machinery, the buildings, the transportation infrastructure, the cars, and then the people, right? The workers. We put those those are the inputs at one side of the factory, and then what comes out the other side of the factory? Output, stuff we want to consume or stuff we want to invest, or goods or services. Okay, so the economics maxim is that there's no free lunch, but economic growth is the free lunch. So what do I mean by that? I mean that suppose that the same amount of inputs come into the factory tomorrow, and more stuff comes out the other side. Okay. So it's not because there's more machines or because there's more workers that there's more output, but because we have better ways of combining what, the labor and the capital, so we can get more out the other side. That's kind of the magic of one type of economic growth, of technological growth or technological progress. Same number of inputs, but more outputs. It's a free lunch. You get more for the same inputs. There's a good example of this, actually. Let me see if I can actually draw on this slide. So, 1 second here. Okay. I think I can. I don't want to annotate. I think it's better if I draw. It's not going to allow me to do that. I thought I could do that with Adobe Acrobat, but anyway, okay, fine. I'll just annotate. All right, so give you an example of this sort of thing. So for a long time, when people were making soccer balls, if you have a soccer ball, the traditional soccer ball pattern looks something like, here's a terrible version of it. It's something like, oh God, no, I have to draw it. It's like there's some hexagons on it. Okay, see, I've already screwed up, kind of. Okay, that was my best attempt at a hexagon. There's some hexagons on it, and then there's also some pentagons. A pentagon looks like this. My pentagon. Okay, so the thing about a hexagon is that they tile a plane. So you can actually draw a whole plane full of hexagons and not have any difficulty sort of tiling a plane with them without any waste. Okay. But the thing about pentagons is you can't do that. Mathematically, it's impossible for you to actually fill up an entire plane with pentagons. So when you make a soccer ball, actually, what you're doing is you're punching some pentagons out of a sheet of leather traditionally. Okay, so there's different ways you could do it, so there's a pattern. I don't know what it is, but let's say that the pattern looks like, this, something like this. I don't know. I'm not even going to try to draw it. But there's a pattern you can do with the pentagons to try to reduce the amount of waste. And for many years, like for throughout history, they had some way of doing it that wasted, like, I don't know, let's say 15% of the leather that was used to create the pentagons for the soccer balls was wasted because you can't perfectly tile the pentagons across the sheet of leather. And then somebody came up with a way of tiling the pentagons that reduced the waste by like half or something like that. So now instead of wasting 15%, you're only wasting 7% of the sheet of leather. And, you basically end up, you have the same input of leather and you get more soccer balls out the other side simply because you're punching the pentagons out in a more efficient pattern. Okay. So that's like an idea someone had. It's like an invention that somebody came up with about how to organize the production better in a less wasteful way. And then you see that, it's like a free lunch, the same number of inputs, and you get more outputs on the other side. So, that's one way of thinking about economic growth. That example it's not my own. It's actually from an economics paper. The guy, some economists went to I think Pakistan, and where they were using this old pattern, and they tried to show them the new pattern, and then they wanted to see if. So it was like they showed a few factories how to do it with the new pattern, and they wanted to see how quickly the technology spread. It's kind of an interesting study. Yeah, so economic growth, it's a free lunch. So here's an example of how, well, actually, I usually in the class, I ask if anybody knows what's going on here. Can anybody tell what's happening in this picture?
Are they shipping bananas or something like that?
Shipping bananas, exactly. But they're not shipping them, right? They're unloading them. You can see they're carrying the bananas off of the ship, right? So this profession was actually a really important profession in international trade for a long time. It was called being a stevedore. A stevedore was someone who would load or unload a ship. And you can see that this was a pretty difficult process. You got some guys down here in the hold of the ship. They're pulling out these bananas, they're putting it onto a table, and then these guys here are carrying the bananas off of the ship. This is somewhere in Mobile, Alabama. So it's in the United States. And this is maybe 19, I guess, maybe early 20th century. I don't know exactly when. So you would never see anything like this today. Does anybody know how bananas are shipped today? You guys know? It's so just generally, do you guys know how stuff is shipped across the ocean?
In standardized containers by probably Maersk.
Yeah, that's right. Maersk and then other companies. The goods are shipped in containers, right? A container is just a box. And it seems like a simple idea. You're going to put goods into boxes, and then the boxes are loaded and unloaded off the ship. And it's just a much more efficient way of putting things onto and off of ships, because you can have a specialized crane that takes the box off of the ship and puts it onto a truck, and then the truck goes to wherever it's going. So it's like, you load up the truck from, suppose you're sending bananas, you load up the truck at the banana farm, banana plantation, I guess it would be called. Put it onto put the bananas on a truck goes to the ship just takes the container off of the truck where the bananas are, puts it onto the ship, it goes to the other side, wherever it's going on the other side of the ocean. They take the container off the ship, put it back on a truck, and the truck goes like directly to, whatever, the warehouse or the supermarket, wherever the bananas are being sold. So, I mean, you just have so much less of this sort of carrying of bananas onto and off of ships or trucks or whatever. So, that's the kind of thing where it's just a much less wasteful way of bringing goods from one place to another. So you can, in a sense, save a lot of cost, or provide the bananas more cheaply, if you like. Of course, on the other hand, let's see here if I don't have it here. On the other hand, stevedore used to be a pretty common profession, but stevedore is basically gone. Almost doesn't exist. There's still a few of them, but almost doesn't exist now. So that's the other side of economic growth. Okay, so if you were to take a look, let's plot time here from the year 1 AD to the year 2000. And then let's look at world output in 2011 dollars. So in constant dollars, what does world output look like in terms of value? And you could see that basically until about 1700, on this scale, you can't even see any growth in economic output for the, first 1,700 years of this picture. And then you see this dramatic growth here in the in recent years. And it gets especially dramatic. I mean, it was only up to this point until 1980, and then this is since 1980. So I guess the point is that there's been a lot of economic growth recently. And of course, if I look at inside of this figure, here's like the Roman Empire, here's like Tang Dynasty, there's all these, Song Dynasty, there's all these like great flowerings of civilization, and yet they hardly move the needle here on economic growth. So it's really been a recent phenomenon. And then,
Can I ask, how do you measure the trillions of production in medieval times, or something like that?
It's a very interesting question, right? So you have to figure out what was produced, And then you have to think about the value of that now. So I don't really know all the details of how they do it, but I know one thing they look at is, say, the amount of, well, that's, I know they do something with lighting, like how people lit their houses. That seems like it's not quite enough though. You know, I'm not 100% sure how they do that. I should know, and I feel like in the past I had some idea about how they did it, but it's something that economic historians do. I guess you could get an idea about the standard of living. So I mean, if we could figure out what sort of a standard consumption bundle of someone would be in those times, then that would help, right? So I guess most people were probably living at a pretty close to subsistence level. That's probably that's probably a pretty close, for most of the medieval, so most of the medieval time, it's probably a pretty okay assumption that people are living at a subsistence level. Then you could think about the amount of food that they would be eating and then price that out in current dollars. It seems like it's not quite enough though, because like during like these times when sort of like, you know, Tang Dynasty, Roman Empire, there, I guess people probably weren't all living, or weren't mostly living at subsistence level then. Although I say that, I'm not 100% sure. You know, people, even during like, say, the Roman Empire, most people were probably living pretty close to subsistence level. So then you could price that out. Somebody have a comment?
I think that's not only in EU, right? So it's the whole world. So then the Roman Empire is only a very small part.
Yeah, but then you have but I mean, Roman Empire is only a small part. Tang Dynasty is only a small part. But I mean, you know, in the rest of the world at the time, so people are living at pretty much at subsistence level. So you just need to figure out the number of people times the number of calories people would have been eating, and then price out the food. So you're not wrong that the world is bigger than just these small locations where they have these flowerings of civilization. But outside of those places, you know, life was pretty close to subsistence.
It also might just be a trend, right? So if we have the data from 1800 and upwards, then trend it backwards.
Yeah, that would be weird, right? I mean, because growth has been like 1% a year since 1800. So then how do you trend that backwards?
Converges towards existence.
Yeah, you could do that. I hope that's not what they're doing, but yeah. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure how they do it. I think that it is something like sort of assuming that most people throughout most of history were living at a very close to subsistence level. So then if you want to think about total output, it's going to be number of people times the amount of food they were eating at whatever dollar, at, you know, current dollars. I mean, this is the kind of thing where it's true. To get precise numbers here would be difficult, but I mean, to get sort of close to, you know, to get numbers that make sense, or that are close to a close approximation to the real world, I don't think it's so difficult. I think that that's just true, that even, you know, during, I keep saying Roman Empire, but I mean, any period of time until very recent times, almost everyone was farming, because that was what was the main constraint on people. I mean, cities were a small part of the population. Most people were farmers. The historical experience of being a human has mostly been being a farmer. It's only recently that most people live in cities in some parts of the world. So, I mean, I don't think that it's a crazy graph. Like, even if we don't know exactly what the, how to price output from, you know, whatever, the year 800 in Egypt or something, it's not going to be very different than just subsistence plus maybe a little tiny bit. I mean, it can't be. So anyway, I don't know exactly how they do it. That's an interesting question. Look it up. Let's look at a shorter time scale here. Okay, this is source Our World in Data, based on data from the World Bank and Madison Project. Okay, so this Madison Project is a historic. This guy Madison is a economic historian. I think he might no longer be alive, but this is the guy who's trying to figure out these historical output levels. So I guess that this would be the right place to look if we were looking to try to figure out the methodology for figuring it out. Okay, but anyway, if we look from like say 1600 to 2050, what the point of this graph is trying to show is that, you know, it's not just sort of a few countries that are experiencing economic growth. Even countries that, you know, that until very recently were developing countries, you know, even they are experiencing quite quick growth. So this growth is not just a few countries in the world. It seems to be shared quite widely across the world, even if it's true that some countries seem to have grown earlier and more dramatically than others. It looks like the other countries are sort of catching up as well. So it's not only, I mean, there's this famous point, and I think we're actually going to talk about it here in these slides, that, you know, are the richest countries getting richer relative to the poorest countries, or are the poorest countries catching up? Well, you know, if I would have looked in 1800, you know, everybody is pretty much subsistence, and then a couple of countries take off very quickly and become much more wealthy than the others. But if I look today, then you see that the countries that are experiencing growth of like 10% a year, they're developing countries, right? So that's like China and India. There's a lot of catch-up growth, right? So now actually countries are converging, and we're going to see that in a couple of slides. But yeah, so economic growth, that sounds great. But, you know, think about something like, you know, we're talking about these various times, historical times. Most people were living at subsistence level, but there were still, you know, kings and aristocracy that were living quite well. So isn't that just what's happening now in modern times? Isn't it just that the richest people are getting richer? You know, you got Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, but you know, real wages haven't increased for the lowest 50% of the income distribution or something like that for the last 30 years. So I think that, you know, one thing you can look at is extreme poverty. So, you know, that's some arbitrary threshold, but it's a threshold that means you're very, very poor. So it's $2 a day in 2000 something dollars. So constant dollars. It's kind of the amount of money that you'd need to just, like, you know, if you're making less than that, you're going to have a hard time keeping your belly full, right? So, I mean, it's like very, very poor level of living, of income. So what is the number of people living in extreme poverty from 1820 to 2020? Well, that's this black part on the bottom. That's the number of people living in extreme poverty, counted in billions. So it's about 1 billion in 1820, and now it's about, you know, whatever, 600 million people are living in extreme poverty, which is terrible, right? I mean, 600 million people in the world today, or at least in the world of, yeah, today, basically, are living at this extremely low standard of living, which is scandalous. I forgot who it was, maybe Gandhi said something like, you know, as long as anyone is poor, I am poor. And, you know, it's pretty crazy that that's true, that there's still 600 million people living at this level of poverty. But if we look at the number of people that aren't living in extreme poverty, you know, as you guys well know, population growth in the world increased over the second half of the 20th century. So, you know, the number of total people in the world is actually growing at quite a clip here. And you can see that to the point we were talking about how you measure output many years ago, 1,000 years ago, it's only a tiny number of people in 1820, like, let's say less than 5%, maybe even 2% of the population of the world that are not living in extreme poverty. Basically as a first pass in 1820, people are living in extreme poverty. So then, you can use that as a way of just counting people and then counting output. But then what happens is at some point you can see that, there's more people and there's more people in extreme poverty, as a share of total people, number living in extreme poverty is probably going down a little bit. This is like, say some parts of the world are getting richer, but most parts of the world are just kind of still staying poor. And then at some point it changes, like in 1960, 1970, the trajectory here changes. This part starts going down and this part keeps going up. So what it says is that even as the number of people in the world is growing, the absolute number of people in extreme poverty is falling. So not only as a fraction of total people, but in absolute number. There's actually fewer people living in extreme poverty today than there were in 1970, even though the population of the world has increased a lot since then. And here's the same graph, but now it's as a percentage of world population. So in 1820, what's the percentage? Okay, I said less than 5%, but here it says 90%. 90% of people in 1820 are living in extreme poverty. In 2020, it's now 10%, or 2018, it's 10% of people are living in extreme poverty. Okay, they use some other data. Okay, well, yeah, fine. So it seems like there's fewer people living in extreme poverty, but I mean, that's not the only thing that, that's because they have terrible lives working in sweatshops. It's like they're being pushed to work in this modern economy. So, I mean, by some measures, working conditions are getting better all over the world. So if you look at something like child labor, now of course these are 3 European/Western countries here, but in 1850, 30% of children in England were working. Okay. And in 1880 in the United States, still more than 20% of children were working. In Italy, look at this, 1890, 70%, 65% of children working. And look how quickly this declines to basically very few today, or by 1850. And then, that's fine for these different regions of the world, but what about the world as a whole? So this is something calculated by the International Labor Organization, and you can see that that's actually decreasing over time. Still a lot of child labor in the world. More than 10% of all children in the world are working, but still seems like it's decreasing over time. It's probably a good thing. Occupational deaths. So deaths per 100,000 workers per year in 1910. It's like 60 deaths per 100,000 workers. So what's that? 6 deaths per 10,000. So a little under, it's not huge, but if you think about working for 30 years, your chance of dying in an occupational related hazard was, not negligible. But that's been falling, and now it's much more negligible to die in occupational related accidents. So in some senses, it's actually getting safer to work in the world over time. And there's less child labor over time as well. Okay, yeah, that might be true. But what about inequality, right? Inequality is growing. That's like one of the standard political issues these days, is we all know that inequality is increasing. Right? It's a huge problem. But wait a second. Inequality is not growing, it's falling, right? Inequality has been falling dramatically over the last, say, 20, 30 years. But that's when we look at inequality in the world, right? And the reason why is because the basically a bunch of places in the world that were very economically less developed in, like, say, 1980, have become developed in the interim. Okay, so if we look at international inequality from 1820 to 2020, well, of course it's increasing. You know, it's going to increase a lot because basically here everybody is subsistence. Then a few places start kind of becoming wealthier. That's going to increase inequality as long as it's only a few places that are becoming wealthier. And then at some point that trend stops. And now we don't have as much time here, but for this series, this is unweighted. This is each country is a data point. Here it's each person is a data point, which is probably better if you're thinking about inequality. You know, bigger countries should count for more. And then what you see is this big fall. And the big fall is, of course, the increase in economic prosperity of India and China, basically. So, you know, if you think about inequality in the world, it's actually been decreasing over the last 30 years, not increasing, despite what you might feel like. Okay. What about the Gini index within countries? So now I'm not sure if I'm going to talk about that here, but Gini index is some way to measure how unequal a distribution is. And a Gini index of 0 is complete equality. A Gini index of 1 is complete inequality in the sense that, suppose we're talking about income. One person has all of the income in the country and everybody else has nothing. Okay, that would be a Gini index of 1. So we can think about how, and why do we care about a Gini index? It's one number that can summarize how unequal distribution is. You know, typically you think about, well, there's the 90-10 percentile. I could look at the 95th to 10th percentile. I could look at the top 50% versus the bottom 50%. There's like many different statistics you could use. The Gini index is a way to summarize the whole distribution with just one number. Yeah, the higher it is, the more inequality. And what you see is that if we go from 1675 to about 1875, well, what you get is you get a very high level of inequality by modern standards. And that's because it really is a place where, you know, England, UK, and US as well, let's especially focus on England, UK. That is the situation where pretty much all of the income goes to just a small number of people, right? That's the aristocracy. So, you know, you do have a very unequal distribution of income because almost everything is owned by just a few people, or almost all the income is taken by just a few people. So that starts dropping, right? After the second half of the 19th century in both England and the US. In England, it drops a bit farther than in the US. And then it's been rising since. Okay. So inequality is high now, higher in the United States and in the UK than it was 50 years ago, but it's lower than it was 100 years ago. Okay. So anyway, this is now again world inequality. So we're not looking at a one number summary of inequality. We're looking at a distribution of income in different years. So in 1800, okay, this line here represents the value of extreme poverty. So you can see it's about $2 per day. So anything below this line is extreme poverty. Anything above this line is not extreme poverty, but you can still be very poor, right? If you're making exactly $2 a day, you're not in extreme poverty, but you're still very poor. But anyway, it's just some arbitrary line to say this is below this line, you're going to have a very hard time keeping your belly full and keeping a roof over your head. And you can see that in 1800, that's this lowest graph. Pretty much, 90% of the world was in extreme poverty. There wasn't that much inequality because everybody was very, very poor. Okay. What happened from 1800 to 1975 is that we got two different worlds. We got one world that still looked like the 1800 world. Okay. So it's still mostly extreme poverty in this one part of the world. And then we have another part of the world where very few people are in extreme poverty. Okay, so we have these two humps, which means lots of inequality. There's a big difference between being in this hump or this hump of the distribution. And then finally, we get to 2015. Oops. And what do we see? We see that now, again, there's only one hump. And the reason why is because a lot of this mass in this part of the world sort of has now escaped extreme poverty. Okay, so there's actually less inequality in the world today than there was in 1975. And it's simply because there's been this convergence across countries. So there's a economist at, I think, the World Bank, I want to say, who made this graph and has become famous for it. What the heck is the guy's name? Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on his name. I know he's got like a Branko Milanovic. Does that sound right? Anybody know this guy? Branko Milanovic, is that right? Anyway, whatever. It's he came up with this graph, and it kind of summarizes the discussion we've had so far. People call it the elephant graph because it looks like an elephant. See, this is the trunk, and then here's the rest of the elephant. So what this graph shows, so let's look at the x-axis. This is the initial percentile of global income distribution. So we're going to line all the people up in the world in order of their income, and then that's who's represented on this line. And let's say we're going to do it in 1988. So we're going to take everybody in the world in 1988 and put them along this line of the graph from lowest income to highest income. And then here we have gain in real income from 1988 to 2008. So 20-year gain in real income. And what you see is that for most people in the world, this was a good time. So for say the poorest, the very poorest people, they had actually not that much growth. But you know, if we get to like say the 10th percentile, then they saw their income increase by like 40% in those 20 years, real income. And you know, then you know, at the 50th, the median person in the world saw their income increase by like 65% in those 20 years in real terms. Okay, so you know, except for say the very poorest people, this was a pretty good time in the world. There was a lot of income growth, except for this little area here. And who is this area? This is people that were quite rich in 1988, had pretty high income in 1988 relative to the world, but didn't have the highest incomes. This is like manufacturing workers in rich countries, or like low educated workers in you know, Western developed countries. So they didn't have a very good time. They didn't see very much income growth. However, the richest people actually saw income growth that was almost as high as, you know, 65%. They got like 50% income growth during this period. So it's like, for most people in the world, this was a good time. Inequality was decreasing in the entire world. But for low income workers in quote, rich countries, you can see that this was not such a great time in terms of income. So that explains our politics. It's been a good time in the world, but not such a great time in within countries. Okay. Yeah, inequality is decreasing, but that's, you know, does anybody ever talk about the fact that it now takes two incomes to support a family? Have you heard this argument? It takes, you know, it used to be in 1950 or 1940, you know, you'd have a married couple, they'd have kids, and one of them, almost always the man, would be out working, and the woman would be at home taking care of the kids, and you could live a pretty good middle-class existence. You could have a nice life. The man might be a factory worker or something. So, you know, that was enough to buy a house, to have a life. But these days, it's very hard to make ends meet unless you have both spouses working. Okay. So, you know, is all this economic growth we've been seeing just an artifact of this fact that we've had like sort of half of the workforce has recently entered the economy? So of course economic growth grows, but you know, are people really better off? Anybody want to say anything about that, by the way, before I move on? Does that sound like a reasonable idea? I'm noticing, I'm looking through the class. We have, this class is, if I'm reading these names correctly, I can see that there's, it looks like there's maybe, there's definitely a significant majority of male names in this class. Is that right? You guys have, are you guys like majority male? Out of curiosity? Yeah. Anybody? Okay, well, fine. I won't push you. This is a very difficult format to actually to have this sort of class discussion. But anyway, you know, there's a problem with this framing. The framing I've done, actually, I think is very standard framing. I hear people make this argument a lot. But, you know, it's not like people that were staying at home in the 1950s were not working. They were also working. It's just that they weren't being paid for it, right? So if we look at the number of leisure hours per week, the amount of time that's spent not working, you know, and here working is a broad concept of working, including housework and, you know, childcare. Then we see that actually leisure has been increasing for men, but also for women. Even as women have entered the workforce, it's not surprising that leisure sort of increases less, especially recently for women, as well, maybe, I don't know, maybe it is surprising. But anyway, for both genders in this period, leisure is increasing. Although you can see for women, it dropped at some point from 1995 to 2005 and then rose again. So especially up until like say 1990, it's increasing in tandem. Like, you know, both genders have an increase in their leisure time per week. Okay, so even though women are working formally, it doesn't mean that people have less leisure time than they used to have. Okay, if you said, why is it that men's leisure time here increases more than women's? My guess here is that actually male employment has fallen. Like there's been more men have dropped out of the formal labor force and are both unemployed and on disability and stuff like that. And that's my guess. I'll just leave it there. So how can we see this? Another way to look at it is looking at hours doing housework. So here's the hours of housework per week going from 0 to 70. And you can see that in 1900, people were working 60 hours a week doing housework. 60 hours a week, right? I mean, that's crazy. And it makes sense if you think about it, right? I mean, there was more involved with like washing clothes. If you've ever washed clothes by hand, you know, it's a very, very laborious process that takes a long time. When I was a kid and I was traveling, you know, as a kid around like China, often I wouldn't have any way of washing my clothes, so I washed them by hand, and it just took a really long time, and my hands that aren't used to doing that, I'd get all like rough. I get like, you know, sores all over them from doing it. And, you know, fetching water, right, was a huge task. To have to go somewhere, fill up water, carry it back to your house. It's a big deal. So, I mean, you can see that housework hours is decreasing a lot over time. And you could ask again, how do they know about this one? This one I know. They actually have surveys where they ask about how you spend your time. And they've been doing those surveys for a long time. So they're called time use surveys. So anyway, yeah, so we see housework hours decrease over time. And then how can we explain that decrease? Let's look at the percentage of households going from 0 to 100 that own various appliances. Okay, so something like a refrigerator Okay, so that goes from basically no one in 1920. About half of people owned one. Half of people owned one in 1940, and by 1960, almost everybody owned a refrigerator. Electricity is like that, running water. And then how about a vacuum cleaner? You know, vacuum cleaner, 50% of people owned one in 1950. What about a washing machine? Okay, that one, I guess, it's a little bit earlier. I'm actually surprised how early that is. 50% of people owned one in 1925 or 1930. That one makes sense though, right? Because a washing machine is a game changer in terms of housework. Stove, okay? So 50% of people had a stove in 1988. Microwave, same thing. What else do we have on your dishwasher? 50% in in the 1980s at some point. So yeah, even though, I mean, the reason that both spouses are working now is because appliances have have taken away a lot of the or informal work that was done inside of the house just to maintain the household. So it's not really true. It's an artifact of what we count in GDP and what we don't, that both spouses are working, or in labor statistics, I should say. Yeah. But that's just consumerism, right? I mean, people are working hard, but that's because they're like, they're just buying crap that they don't need, and they're producing all kinds of plastic junk that's going into the oceans, that's going into the fish that we end up eating. So we ourselves are becoming junk as we're eating all of the plastic that we make for all this crap consumerism, right? So what's the big deal about all this modern growth? Who cares? It's just making us all fat, boring people or something like that. So I like the next set of slides, but I think I'm gonna give you guys a 10-minute break before we do that, because it's kind of a bit of a shift in gears. So let's take a 10-minute break. Okay, so let's get rid of this dude. All right, so in the interim, I actually checked out the an answer to the question that we had earlier, which was about how they measured GDP historically. One second here. Let me get back to Zoom. So there's actually a really interesting relationship. So I have this from some slides for a different class actually. So let me quick pull those up. Why doesn't it come up? Must be a Zoom thing. Arg. Okay, here we go. Okay, so it turns out that there's this relationship that's really, it's like what they call an empirical regularity, that when people get richer, so let's look at these curves here, if you can see them. So on the y-axis, we have food consumption. On the x-axis, we have purchasing power parity GDP per capita. Okay, so you could just think about output per capita on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, food consumption. And what you see is that as people get richer, each dot here is a country. So as people get richer, they tend to consume more food, or consume more food. And it makes sense, right? If you get richer, you're going to eat more. I mean, or higher quality. I guess you can't really eat more calories necessarily, but you're going to eat higher quality calories. So you will spend more on food. Now let's look at the second graph here. Again, on the x-axis, we have GDP per capita. And on the y-axis, we have, rather than food expenditure, we have food expenditure share. So we're looking at, as a total, like as a fraction of total expenditures, what share is spent on food. Okay, and you can see that for the poorest countries here, it's something between 50 and 80%. Okay, for the richest countries, it's more like 10%. Okay, so there's this relationship, and in fact, here it's drawn with a curve, but sometimes it's even assumed to be linear. Okay, a relationship between output per capita and food expenditure share. Okay, so it turns out that actually that is what is used to calculate these historical measures of output. Okay, so we have somehow people have an approximate idea about the number of people that were alive at different times. And then occasionally, not that often, but occasionally you'll actually get accounts of what a household's annual expenditures would look like. So I'll give you an example here. I think I have one here. If I don't, it's too bad. Okay, I do have it. Okay, so this is an example about an annual working man's budget in Philadelphia in 1851. I have no idea where this was recorded, but it was recorded somewhere. You know, what does somebody spend in a year? And what you see is that, you know, here's what they bought: butcher's meat, flour, butter, potatoes, sugar, amount in dollars at the time in 1 year. And then here's the percentage of total expenditures on that particular good. And the important point is this one here, which is total expenditures for food add up to about 41%. Okay. And then the rest of expenditures are about 60%. So if we know that relationship between share of expenditures on food and GDP, then we can back out what is the GDP per capita of Boston in 1850. So, you know, of course, there's a lot of heroic assumptions in that process, but you asked where these historical measures of output come from, and they come from this method, in fact. So I looked up the particular source for that data, the Angus-Maddison project. So that's the answer to that question. Any questions about that? Uh-oh. Why did it do that? So you recall the last slide? Yeah, that's just consumerism. Now here's our shift in tone. Check out child mortality, okay? So this is the year from 1750 to 2020 here on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, the percentage of children that died before the age of 5. Okay. So you can see that in 1750 in Sweden, where they have the longest records from church records, I think, it was something like 30%. So, you'd expect that of all children, 30% would die. So, I mean, before age of 5. So if any of you, I guess you're all young, quite a bit younger than me, but if any of you have children, I mean, to imagine that 1/3 of your children will die before the age of 5, I mean, why would anyone even have children? That would just be such a terrible tragedy. And yet that was the world that people lived in. And, that was just something that people dealt with in their lives. Just something absolutely terrible. And then you can see how much that's dropped, to the point that it's negligible. And it's not just in sort of, quote, developed countries. Also, even in, say, Ethiopia, where child mortality is scandalously high, 25% in 1980, terribly high, even there in the last 40 years, that's dropped significantly. You could say something similar, but I mean, it's kind of a corresponding drop in child disease, right? So this is the years from 2000. This is a much shorter period, 2000 to 2013. And then here we have the number of deaths of children under 5 in the world. And you can see that these are dropping over time, again, even as the population is increasing during this period. It says childhood deaths from infectious diseases, but okay, I guess HIV/AIDS is infectious. Child stunting and other things. So it turns out that when you, if you don't eat enough when you're a very young child, then there can be lasting effects on how tall you ever grow or how strong you ever get. So when children are starved at a young age and then don't sort of grow into full size or have sort of permanent effects of that, then that's called child stunting. Okay, and it's again scandalously high, the number of stunted, the levels of child stunting in the world even today. But let's look at the percentage of children under 5 who are stunted, going from 1965 to 2015. And you can see that these levels pretty much in every country are falling over time. So there's less sort of child starvation, if you like. Undernourishment, so kind of a corresponding thing, children, okay, this isn't children, this is people. Percentage of people who are undernourished, going from 0 to 35 here on the y-axis, and starting in 1970 up to 2015 on the x-axis. So in the developing world, it's falling over time, and it's kind of falling uniformly over time. Okay, so it turns out that people seem to be getting enough calories more often all over the world, although still, again, scandalously high. Look at, 25% of people being undernourished in sub-Saharan Africa is pretty terrible, but still getting better over time. So famine, so something terrible. I mean, and just part of the human experience for most of history would be that some years crops, there would be a bad harvest and there just wouldn't be enough to eat. And, you hear stories about, people eating like tree bark and things like that. And, it just sounds like something absolutely terrible. And if we look at the number of deaths from famine from 1860s to the present, I mean, this is a story of lots of deaths until basically the 1970s, and then almost no deaths since from famine. So, I mean, this is a problem this is like a terrible part of what it used to be like to be alive in the world that is just gone, more or less today. Today, you know, famines aren't because of too little food. It's because of bad food distribution, right? So it's like, you know, there's food available, but it doesn't get to the people that need it, as I understand. And then calories per person per day, it's the same thing. It's going up over time, especially in poorer countries. What about life expectancy? So life expectancy has been increasing. It's been increasing, but not as quickly as GDP. I'll have a comment on that in a second. So let's look from 1760 to 2020 at life expectancy in different, you know, the dark black line is the whole world. And then the other lines are different parts of the world. So this is average life expectancy at birth. Okay, so in 1770, it was 30 years. Of course, this is affected by the fact that many children died before the age of 5. But, you know, that increases pretty dramatically with the fall in child mortality, and then just increases in longevity to the point where now in the whole world, it's like 70. So it went from 30 years to 70 years. So, I mean, in the last couple hundred years, it's more than doubled. You expect when you're born, you expect to live more than twice as many years as you'd expect to live 200 years ago. So that's a pretty dramatic and important thing that has nothing to do with consumerism. Okay. And more or less uniform. Yeah, fine. Those things are all great. They're different than consumerism. That's fine. But we can only do that because we're extracting all of these resources from the earth. You know, we're basically ripping up the entire world. Can't do that forever. So the first thing is to mention the population growth, somewhat luckily, I think, is slowing down. Okay, so if we look at x-axis here, 1750 and then here's where we are, 2020, say. So the dark part is data, and this part is extrapolation. So the population growth rate actually increases as people started getting richer, say from 1900 up until 1975. But then, so this is at this point in 1975, if you actually go back and read like the literature by, say, environmentalists in 1975, this is considered like the huge problem in the world, is that population growth keeps increasing. The world is finite. There's a finite amount of resources. So there's this famous book that comes out in the 1970s called Lifeboat Earth, which says that, you know, here we are on this planet that's, you know, traveling through space, and it's like a lifeboat. And if there's too many people on the lifeboat, it's going to sink, right? So that was the metaphor. But anyway, somewhat miraculously, maybe, the annual growth rate of population has started falling. And it's actually been falling ever since the 1970s. And it's just on a trend where it keeps falling. And there's some good economics reasons why this might be. But anyway, people expect that sort of the population of the world is going to max out around like 2050, 2060 at a level that's not, you know, it's significantly higher than what it is today, but not crazy high. It's like, you know, I don't know, like 10 billion people or something like that, or 12 billion people relative to today's 8 billion people. So the economics, I don't know how much there is to it, but the economics reason that people think the population growth is slowing is that basically women have become more educated. And as women become more educated, their outside opportunities for working in, like, you know, the formal sector outside of the household increase. So the opportunity cost of having a child actually goes way up, because you can't work outside the household. You know, it's harder to work when you have a young child, as we have learned throughout the COVID experience. So, you know, it's become costlier in a sense in terms of opportunity cost to have children. So that's caused people to have fewer children and then invest more in each child. So they, somewhat provocatively, the University of Chicago economist Gary Becker called it the quantity quality trade-off, which is, I think it was meant to be a bit provocative, but you know, that's the economic explanation for why population growth is slowing. What about pollution? Okay, so let's look at the percentage change in pollution. Okay, so we're going from 1970 to 2020. So the baseline level here is 1970. So how has pollution changed since 1970 in an absolute level? Well, first let's look at population. So population has grown about 50% in the world since 1970. Okay, so first let's look at the very good news, which is emissions. 5 different pollutants. I believe this is the I forget what it's called, chloroform, hydrox, something. It's the ones that's in spray. It's aerosol spray cans, and you know, it's causing a hole in the ozone layer in like the early 1990s. Those have gone way down because they've been heavily regulated. What's happened with GDP? Well, GDP has increased about 250% since 1970 in the world. Vehicle miles has increased about 200%. But you can see that CO2 emissions, or CO2, I wonder if this is levels or emissions. It must be emissions. CO2 emissions have increased since 1970. But recently, it looks like they're sort of not increasing as much. And energy usage generally has increased, but not as much as population, and certainly not as much as vehicle miles or GDP. So, I mean, what picture do we draw here? Well, yeah, that's right. We are polluting more. We're using more energy and we're using more CO2 than we were in 1970 as the world population. But maybe it's not quite as bad as you might have predicted based on population growth and like vehicle mile growth and GDP. What about CO2 intensity? So again, this is CO2 emissions per dollar of GDP. So of course, GDP has grown a lot. I mean, you can already see what this picture is going to look like from the last picture, which is GDP has really grown a lot, but CO2 emissions have not grown as much. So what you see now, we're looking at a longer time period, 1820 to 2020. First, CO2 emissions in the world per unit of GDP increase. Why is that? Well, we're using steam, we're using electricity that takes coal. Both of them take coal to produce. So rather than traditional methods of producing things, we're using more sort of coal intensive ways. And that's increasing the amount of CO2 emissions per unit of GDP. But then since about 1960, that's been falling, especially in sort of the older developed countries. So kind of famously, both China and India, they're still on the bottom part of this curve. So some people predict that this is what's sometimes called the environmental Kuznets curve. So it's like a hump. So at the beginning part of development, countries are on the lower part of the hump, but then as they get toward a more developed state, then they are go on the other side and they start having less CO2 per unit of GDP, which is sort of a good thing, right? So even though China and India seem to be polluting a lot, there's some, we might predict that they will be polluting less as their countries become more developed. Oil spills, even though we have more oil shipped by sea since 1970, we have a lot less oil spills. Deforestation, now we're going from 1625 to 2025. You may know that basically in like the early modern era, all forests were cut down. Like, so I'm American, right? So I know that like in the United States, I'm from like a pretty rural part of the United States, Wisconsin. And I went to school in Pennsylvania. In both places, they basically had just chopped all of the forests down. They were like, any forest you see is no older than 100 years because everything was gone. They cut everything down. So that's kind of decreased over time. Tropical rainforest, That actually had an increase in deforestation up to about 1975, but due to activism, that's been decreasing recently. What about natural disasters? Well, we can't stop natural disasters. They're going to happen no matter what. But what we can do is maybe we can prevent deaths. Okay. So how many people die from natural disasters? So this is, again, controlling for population, right? So deaths per 100,000 people. That's actually falling over time, falling pretty dramatically from 1900 to 2010. Even though there's still as many earthquakes and maybe even more hurricanes, less people die than in the past because of better construction materials, etc. More protected areas. Okay, let's stop there. Yeah, fine. Okay. But think about like terrorism and like failed states, nuclear weapons, civil war. The world is becoming more violent over time. Okay, so the first thing is that we seem to be very fixated on terrorism. I don't know why. Actually, very few people die from terrorism. So if you look at, I mean, maybe it's because of how horrible the attacks are and how random it is. You know, you're just going out to get groceries and then you end up dying from terrorism or something. But really, if you look at over time, so let's go from 1970 to 2015, in Western Europe, there's actually been a pretty significant decrease in terrorism. Okay, so it's different types of terrorism, right? Previously, terrorism might have been more about separatism, or maybe, there was in, like, say, the UK, they had stuff with Northern Ireland, that sort of thing. And then more recently, it's been sort of Islamic terrorism, right? But overall, the level of terrorism is going down. And in the United States, you can see terrorism is at an extremely low level until 2000. There's almost none of it. And then there's September 11th, and there's this huge spike where lots of people died. But then it's basically remained at zero since then. And if we look at the entire world, if we exclude major civil war zones, because there it's a bit difficult to, what is terrorism and what's not becomes sort of a difficult line to delineate. Then this is going down until recently. Yeah. So I guess the main takeaway from this picture is this one about Western Europe. We live in Western Europe, and it seems like terrorism is worse than it used to be, but actually there's fewer deaths than there used to be from terrorism. Battle deaths per capita per year in the whole world, going from 1945 to 2015, that also falls, although there's a lot of humps in it with various wars. Soviet war in Afghanistan, the American war in Vietnam. Here is the Korean War, probably. Interesting that this starts in 1945, because if you let it go before 1945, there would have been a huge spike because of World War II. Okay. But anyway, seems to be low and staying constantly low for now, at least. Great power wars. This is almost unheard of these days. This is going from 1500 now to 2000. Countries used to fight each other for land and territory and stuff like that. That happened a lot. And basically since about 1980, it just hasn't happened at all. It's just at zero. Nuclear weapons, yes, they're terrible. And yes, we still have a lot of them, but we actually have a lot fewer of them now than people had in like 1990. Measures of genocide. So 1955 to 2015, there's actually a lot less genocide today than there used to be. So another sort of good thing. What about within countries? Homicide. So somewhat surprisingly, in the United States, until a little uptick recently, homicides are falling. In England, they're at a much lower level and they're kind of constant. But in the whole world, the number of homicides per capita has been decreasing over time. And this graph's a little bit, I don't quite get this graph, but it basically says that there used to be much, much more homicide. This is actually from an earlier Steven Pinker book, where he talks about how likely you were to die a violent death before like 1800 and even before 1900. I mean, it was like a significant fraction of people just died somehow violently, either by someone killing you or by being run over by something, or, you know, somehow falling down on something, whatever, like some sort of accident. It was just that, like, you know, it was something like, I forget what it is, but let's say like, you know, 50% of people or something like that would expect to die a violent death rather than a death in, you know, out of sickness or old age. Executions falling dramatically over time. It used to be that you had to execute people in terrible ways because you catch so many fewer criminals. I mean, the police, the state has grown much larger. So it used to be in the past, criminals were very unlikely to be caught. So what did they use as deterrence? Well, they just, if you were caught, you would be treated very, very badly. Right? Domestic violence is falling. Bullying, surprisingly, you know, it seems like there's more of it, but this is one of those things where I think people are talking about it more. So it feels like there's more bullying with like all this cyberbullying and whatnot. But if you actually look at surveys of bullying that people have been doing since like the 1990s, bullying is actually falling over time. It's just that, you know, it's become something that people are more aware of, and there's more activism about it. So I think that it feels like there's more of it, but actually there's less of it. It's because we're paying attention to it that there's less of it. The same for physical.
Where do these numbers come from for bullying?
Yeah, these ones are American, I think. And they're based on a survey that they give to school districts across the United States. Okay, so anyway, okay, fine. That's all great. That all looks fine. But, you know, think about where we're heading. We're heading for less democracy. Look, I mean, come on. We just saw that the American Capitol building was invaded by, you know, a bunch of people who wanted to overthrow the government. That's pretty crazy. We can see everywhere in Europe. We have, you know, nationalist parties in Hungary. We have in Denmark, I would say, even though the Dansk Folkeparti they didn't do great in the last election, but that's because all of the other parties sort of moved towards their positions on immigration. So, I mean, you know, we're kind of getting into this natalist, nativist, not natalist would be, we should have more kids. Although I bet these populist parties would agree with that. Natalist, nativist, sort of our country against your country type of, you know, tribalism in our politics, more authoritarianism, less democracy, you know, so, you know, the past might look okay, but what about the future? I mean, can we expect, what can we expect from the future? Well, it's hard to guess what we can expect from the future, but at least we can say that things aren't quite as dire as they seem. So if we look at a measure of countries by democracy versus autocracy score over time, like an average in the world, then what we see is that, you know, in 1800, basically countries were autocratic. I mean, they were run by kings and aristocracies. And over time, you know, there's this upsurge where countries become more democratic. And then throughout the world wars and, you know, I don't know, colonialism, they become less democratic. And then there's this big upsurge in a democracy index. This is the end of the Soviet Union here in the late 80s. And now actually, even though it seems like countries are becoming less democratic, at least by this measure, I don't know exactly how it's calculated, they're becoming more democratic over time. And I think this is maybe the surprising one and the interesting one in several dimensions. So there's like this world values survey where they ask people about what they think about various things. Say, you know, do you think that women should be allowed in the workforce, or do you think that, you know, men, or do you think that, you know, let's say, do you think that being homosexual should be outlawed or something like that? They ask questions like that about people's values in different societies. and then people constructed sort of a one number index that goes from 0 to 1 about sort of emancipative values. You could think about them as sort of liberal values that are sort of, you might associate with the Enlightenment. You know, people should have the right to vote. You know, everybody should have a certain amount of equality, type of thing. So, you know, I don't know the details. You can look it up if you want, but it's some measure like that. So let's look from 1960 to 2007. Okay, so I don't know if there is no world line here, but what you can see is that there's this trend where pretty much more and more people are agreeing with these emancipative values, or they're getting higher scores on the emancipative values index. So that's fine. But what I think is interesting here is that it's true of everywhere in the world, right? So, I mean, it doesn't matter if we're talking about Western Europe or the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or Central and Eastern Europe, but we can also be looking at Latin America, East Asia, South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Islamic, Middle East, and North Africa. You know, the levels here are different, but the trend is the same. Okay, so it's like all over the world, people's values seem to be moving in a single direction towards this sort of liberal Enlightenment type values. Which, you know, you and I, as probably relatively educated people, tend to hold values that are similar to these. So, I mean, you know, we might believe that this is a good thing. It also says that in some ways, you know, where there's some sort of world culture in a way that there didn't used to be, which I find very interesting. So, human rights, more mixed message in the world. You can say if we have some sort of index of human rights protection, it seems like things are getting somewhat better in the world since, say, 1980. This goes 1945 to 2015. But, you know, there's some trends that are better and worse. So in China, you can see that maybe they're kind of getting lower on the human rights index until recently. North Korea is getting worse over time. Yeah. So one interesting thing to think about is education for its own sake. You know, the economics way of thinking about education is human capital, but you know, education by itself is a good thing, right? I mean, it's part of being a human is to understand, you know, what it's like to be able to think about what it means to be alive and to, you know, have a dialogue with thinkers from the past and stuff like that. You know, so education by itself is a good thing. And we can see that all over the world since 1820, you know, levels of education have been just increasing a lot. You know, even in places in the world that are less developed or have more challenges, you see that the percentage of adults with basic education is, you know, above 50% now. So that's a good thing. And years of schooling, so it's not just percentage with basic education, but even if we look at sort of the total education, the years of schooling, that's increasing everywhere since 1875. So people are becoming more educated. Homosexual decriminalization. So, you know, being homosexual has become decriminalized almost everywhere now. It's not everywhere, unfortunately, but almost everywhere. Okay. Measures of populism. Okay, so what we're looking here is a slightly different graph. Okay, so we're looking at birth cohort on the x-axis. So people born in 1930 versus people born in 1995. And then we're asking them what percentage voted for Trump in the United States or Brexit in the UK. And what you see is that people that are older, about 50, you know, to 60% of them voted for Trump, Brexit, or European populist parties. But younger people tend to vote much more for, much less for Brexit, Trump, and populist parties. Okay. So there's a generational difference here. Younger people tend to be less populist. So you might say, well, that's fine, but younger people are eventually going to get older, and when they get older, they're going to be more populist again. That's true to a degree, This is a little bit hard to interpret graph, but again, on the x-axis, we have birth year. This is now only in the United States. On the y-axis, we have the same emancipative values index now going from 0 to 100. Okay, and what we see is that this was a test in 1980. This is the test in 2005. And what we see is that it's true that as people get older, they get lower scores on the emancipative values index, right? They were born earlier, so they get lower scores on this emancipative values index. The same is true in 2005. People who are older have lower emancipative value scores. But there's a shift of the curve. So at every age group, people have more emancipative values now in 2005 relative to 1980. Okay, so there is some sort of change as people get older. People tend to become more populist, maybe more quote conservative, or like have lower, conservative is the wrong word, but have a lower score on the emancipative values index. But there's been a shift in the curve over time. So everybody at every age group has relatively more emancipative values. All right, guys, I have you until 9:40, I think, so I don't have much time. Let's see here. Well-being and income. It's true that we were talking about income, but if we talk about other measures like human development indices, then that's looking better over time as well. Happiness surveys tend to increase with GDP per capita. People are less lonely. Suicides holding more constant, a little bit hard to explain. And then I like this one. In the United States, how happy are Americans from 1970 to 2018? Percent agreeing with how happy are you? Very happy. It's about 30%. That's about constant, even falling a little bit to 2018. So Americans tend to be less happy, but more of them are saying life is exciting. Yeah. So if the world's better, why does it feel like everything's worse? I'll just maybe leave it here. It turns out that over time, the tone of news has become more negative, especially since the 1980s. The tone of news in the world has become more negative. And one of the reasons for that, people think, is because of the rise. It's kind of an interesting thing because of the rise of like the 24-hour news channel. So whether that be the actual cable TV 24-hour news channel like Fox News, that was the first to just always be 24 hours news instead of other programming with news added to it, to the internet now, right? So the internet is like a 24-hour news channel in the sense that, you know, you can look at the news anytime, and people always want to, you know, like even me, I'm a bit of a news junkie, so I'll check, you know, my news feed several times every day, and then, you know, maybe there's something new, and it just happens that people are more likely to click through or to watch negative news. You know, if somebody says something terrible happened, click through. If they say something good happened, maybe not. So there's one really nice, let me just end on this slide then. So one really nice thing is that this, I guess you'd call him an economist named Max Roser, who has a great website called Our World in Data that has been doing great COVID news, by the way, if you haven't heard of it. He says that newspapers could have had the headline, "Number of people in extreme poverty fell by 137,000 since yesterday, every day of the last 25 years." Okay, so every single day, 137,000 fewer people escaped extreme poverty. You know, how's that for some positive news? So that's it. That's what I'm going to talk about today. Anybody have any comments or thoughts? I will say that I'm a little bit, when I made these slides, like the first version of these slides was when I read that book maybe 2 years ago, Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. I would say that I've somewhat moderated my views a bit about this, about progress since then.
Have you read Factfulness by
Hans Rosling? I actually did read it. In fact, what I used to do, and I should have done it today, is I usually give the quiz.
Oh yeah, the quiz in the beginning is the best.
And I usually do it before I do these slides, and I do it after. I should have done that today. I didn't though. He's He's tricky in that quiz though. If now I've been like kind of studying it a little bit, so he phrases the questions in a way that sort of leads people astray. It is a good quiz though, so I feel like I've sort of by giving this presentation first, I've sort of ruined your ability to objectively view the quiz, but I can share it actually if you guys want. I have a Kahoot for it.
Yeah, but factfulness takes on like other things than just GDP growth and stuff.
Well, yeah, but it's the same kind of things we're talking about here, right? Child mortality and stuff like that. It is a good book, though. It's a good book. I mean, so actually, this guy Max Rosser, I have him here on this slide. He's kind of like the spiritual successor to Hans Rosling, I guess his name is, who died recently, a couple of years ago, I think. Yeah, this Our World in Data is a really nice resource, and he's got lots of good COVID stuff, kind of from in a similar vein. So usually people, there's some critiques you could have of this sort of thinking. So one of them might be something like, imagine that we're sitting in 1910 and we're talking about, the last 100 years, it's just been great. Isn't everything going to just be great for humanity? We just expect everything to progress beautifully. But then, then there's World War I or World War II, and a lot of really, really terrible things happened, especially to some populations of people. So, just because things have been good for the last couple hundred years doesn't mean they're going to be good in the future, is one thing people say. Another thing you might say is, this is a very narrow view of progress. It's progress measured by the things that we've done very well in. But, there's other sorts of progress that might be something like moral progress. Are people more good today than they were in the past? Maybe you can make an argument for that, but it's not necessarily true. If I ask somebody from 1600s from some random place in the world, would they prefer to live where they're living, or would they like to live in today? It's not clear that they would always choose they want to live today, because they might think that we're less moral today by some measure of morality. So having said that, that's all I've got for the day. So I will send you guys an email about what you need to do for next Wednesday. It'll probably involve watching my lectures for the solo growth model. But I think that's one of the lectures I want to redo. So I'll try to do that either this afternoon or tomorrow. But I'll send you.
What about the assignment you have opened up?
Yeah. So I've opened up an assignment.
Yeah. If you go to examen CBS, there's an assignment from you that opened up yesterday, I think.
But you don't have
the 9th of February.
But you don't have any actual exam, do you? Or any actual assignment, do you?
No.
Okay.
It's just on the schedule.
Yeah, you'll get that. You'll get that too. But I have to do this. I have to do the lecture first. So I think that one's due like maybe sometime toward the end of February. Is that right? It should be. So anyway,
yeah, it's the 23rd.
It's the 23rd of February, right? So it's coming up soon. But you guys will have enough time to complete it. So yeah.
And is it going to be individual group for the assignment?
Did you say individual?
Yeah.
So I think that you do it in groups of, I think last time I said 3, and then somebody said, no, it's 2 to 4. So you do it in groups of 2 to 4, I think.
Okay, but on the digital exam, it shows it's an individual work.
Okay, well, I think that I give you each a pass-fail grade, but you only turn in one assignment for everyone in the group, so it would be very unusual if some of you passed and some of you failed.
Okay, thanks.
And again, the bar for passing is basically you made an attempt, a serious attempt at every problem. And this first one will be somewhat different because there's so little material. It's like, I don't want to, you know, I need to cover like the solar growth model or else I won't have anything to test you on. So yeah. Any other questions? Okay, cool. Send me an email if you have anything, and I will see you next Wednesday.
Thank you very much.
Yep. See ya.